So I was going to start with Representative Knight to talk about, at the beginning of the session, this reform caucus, which has 19 members by most counts, proposed some changes to the rules of the House of Representatives. It's kind of a quiz. Can you remember what the 4 proposed changes were? Yeah.
Rules. It was get rid of the 2. Am I on?
Yeah, just closer.
So I think it was get rid of suspension of the rules by agreement, right? To do it only with a vote. We wanted a 24-hour. It was 4 items. There was.
I have them if you want me to help you.
Yeah.
So I didn't do this on purpose to quiz you.
No, give me a shot. I think it was. We wanted to. I forget the mechanics, but we wanted to reveal anytime there was going to be a substitute bill. We wanted to have a better preview period so that people could have a chance to vote on it. We wanted the rules thing. We were looking for. I want to say we did something around the discharge petition.
Yeah, so,
to be at the desk.
and there was a 4th one.
And there was a 4th one.
Which is that bills would stay alive for 2 years once introduced in the first year. So as bills stay alive for 2 years, remove the ability of the majority and minority leaders to suspend the rules by unanimous consent, require that substantive amendments be made available 48 hours in advance of a vote in the committee, and then a discharge petition, which is the petition that is signed to get a bill out of committee or onto the floor, could be circulated around the floor, because right now it has to be done at the desk under the eye of the speaker. So those are the 4 proposed.
Does that count for 2.5 out of 4?
Good, you passed the test. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did get in terms of those 4?
So that was the self-styled reform caucus came out and around election day made a big deal. Said we weren't going to vote for Nicholas Mattiello for being the speaker, and also that we were looking to fix a lot of the rules that that govern how the House operates. Now I got to tell you, we spent some time really going through the rules and thinking about where could you get the most bang for your buck. And we did that with an eye towards transparency and small d democratic action. And there's a ton of things you could do. You could overhaul those rules and get a whole lot of transparency and small d democratic action. But we chose some things that we thought were doable and, like I said, gave some bang for the buck. So ultimately, what the only substantive rule change that occurred was changing that preview period for substitute bills. So traditionally, if a representative puts in a bill that's going to come up for a vote, it'll go in, it'll get a committee hearing, it will be, quote, held for further study, and it'll go back into the bowels of the House somewhere in the Legislative Council, and various people in informal conversations will have have talks about it, and the bill will get marked up a bunch of different ways to try to make people happy or to satisfy whatever their needs are. It could be the sponsor, it could be an advocacy group, and then a substitute A will be written up. And traditionally, that substitute A came out about 5 seconds before the committee was going to vote on it to send it to the House floor. And I'm not kidding. Literally, the paper would be hot from the copier when you got it in your hands. And you'd get about this long, and I'm not exaggerating, about this long to read it and then take a vote on it. That's changed. So the Speaker of the House, through the Rules Committee, proposed a change where these substitute bills would get a 24-hour preview period, which I think was crucial in a couple of the votes that we had this year. So now that is a substantive change in favor of transparency. Everyone gets a chance to look at the substitute bill before voting on it. Particularly the public gets a chance to review it and have input before a committee votes on it. So that was the big change.
Yeah, so, and I'll talk about the Senate rules in a second, but Representative Lyle, so you have have served over several decades, and this is not a rule that existed before. Do you have any thoughts about the impact having access to the amendments before you had to vote on them?
That is a welcome change. It's night and day from the days of old. I was in the Senate from 80 to 86 and then from 90 to 94. And we literally got an amendment as Jason was describing, and were expected to vote on it immediately. And so I welcome this particular change. And speaking of welcome, I want to thank you, John, for the invitation to be here, and for all of you to be here on this beautiful evening. This is an important part of the process. Alan and I were talking a little bit earlier, and one of the things we're concerned about is apathy. And thank you for not being apathetic and involved.
No, agreed.
That's a great message. I'll say I was involved in a high school club that one of my classmates had created called Students Against Apathy. And sadly, the club no longer exists because people didn't show up. But no, thank you for coming on a nice summer night. So in the Senate, there was also a fight of sorts over the rules. And I'll ask Senator Sheehan if he can walk through a little bit about, from your perspective, what happened in terms of the rules in the Senate.
Okay, so some of the proposed rules, I just enumerate them, and because it's summer, I actually wrote them down so I wouldn't forget, and hopefully this works for you. But one was that the Senate President could change your committee assignment without your consent. In the Senate rules we've had for many years, since I've been there, 2000, that you had to consent to a change in committee so that it could not be used against you, perhaps as punishment. Another was the majority and minority leaders could waive the Senate rules just by agreement between two people. Another was the Senate had the sole discretion the Senate President, to give discretion for a member to change his or her vote. They implemented a 5-minute speaking rule, which the Senate heretofore was unlimited, although in almost, 19 years I haven't seen a filibuster yet. And another substantive one was, let's see, and elections of the Senate President was another that was there too. I was very involved, I have to say, not publicly but privately, working with the Senate leadership and other leaders in the Senate to push back on these. I thought that represented a further consolidation of authority, which we don't really need to have. I think the Senate has prided itself on being more of a liberal forum in terms of discussion and debate. The net of those was on the removing you from your committee. It could only be done now without your consent, but for cause only. So there needed to be something of a nature of wrongdoing, let's just say. The minority leader, majority leader striking the rules themselves as two people, that was sent to the dumpster, rightfully so. The Senate President having sole discretion to grant permission to change a person's vote, that was also struck down. The 5-minute rule was kept. There are exceptions, say if it's your bill, you're the prime sponsor, or you're the floor manager of a bill that comes over for the House, you have to speak on it, explain it, it takes more time. And the elections did go through. It's still going to be by roll call vote the first day of the session.
Yeah, thank you. Notes helped, apparently. And it was odd from at least our perspective that there was a lot of controversy at the very beginning of the session over the House rules, and then the Senate leadership decided, well, hold my beer, watch this. We'll propose that our rules look more like the House rules, which have typically been, the House rules have not been as good as the Senate rules. So it was a very odd maneuver by the Senate leadership from our perspective that the Senate of all years chose to make their rules more like the House rules.
Except the positive one they did in the House was the 24-hour notice if you change substantively a bill in an amended form.
Yeah. So we, as an organization, reached out to you all through our email list primarily, asking you to contact the Senate and fight some of these. And we tested a new email tool we have that would allow you to write letters. 300 people wrote letters about the Senate rules, which I thought was a pretty good number and a pretty esoteric topic. And of the 3 things we asked people to fight, the Senate removed 2 of them from the rules, and then chose to add the 24-hour rule for the amendments being made public. So I'll ask you, Senator Euer, how did you think in terms of that 24-hour rule? Was that helpful compared to other years you've served, or do you have any other thoughts about the Senate rules and how that turned out?
So I'm, relatively new in the General Assembly. I haven't even been in for 2 years at this point. But for me, the 24-hour rule was incredibly helpful, just to be able to have time to kind of vet bills. We definitely, would check the calendars when things were posted, reading everything in advance as we do, and being able to read that a day in advance and have time to process your thoughts, and also be able to kind of check in with people that you know are stakeholders or have knowledge and expertise about certain issues. Having that 24-hour period definitely gave you a time to kind of better vet that language. I will also say that I'm such like a wonky policy person that when people started reaching out to me about the rules, I was like, my heart went pitter patter because, and also being a lawyer, process matters, and what the rules are that we use to operate within the chamber are incredibly important. So to me, it was really heartening to see the level of engagement that folks had. I do think that one thing that was a little bit challenging, I think, in the Senate is because there was such an attention placed on the House rules and the House process. And, the Senate is a completely different chamber, and there's different dynamics in the chamber. And I think a lot of times the 2 chambers get conflated into one as just amorphous, the State House. And I think we operate very differently in the Senate than the House does. And similar to Senator Sheehan, we sit on the Rules Committee, and there was a lot of dialogue, and we had a hearing about the rules. People came in and gave their testimony, and there wasn't a rush to pass them. We really took our time and had a lot of dialogue about what that was going to look like. So I was happy with the changes that were made, and I appreciate all of you and everyone else who really weighed in. I think that was an important part of the process.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I know there was a lot of sort of inside lobbying, as you both referred to, on that committee to win some of those concessions. So thank you both for fighting for it, because the rules aren't always sort of the sexiest topic substantively, but the process is critically important. And I think people showed up, right? It was important that we had an event here, same location. In the beginning part of the year, we had over 100 people in this room who wanted to learn about the House rules. And they knew that, right? There was some knowledge that there was some energy behind people who were opposed to some of the bad changes to the rules. Any other comments about the rules before we move on? Yes.
I just wanted to throw out this as a coda to the whole rules thing, because there was a big hoopla and a lot of effort thrown out in December, January, when we were voting on our rule set, and our rule set will control until the next General Assembly comes in after the next election. You vote on your speaker and your rules once. It lasts for 2 years. In the past, as you all know, the end of the General Assembly, the last few days, is what I like to call the billathon, right? It's both chambers suspend their rules typically, and we take hundreds and hundreds of votes inside of 24 to 48 to 36 to 48 hours, just depending on how much business there is to do. And a big part of the debate was around the rules. We don't want to do that. Right? We don't want to suspend the rules so that the public can watch what's happening and follow along in real time, see things posted appropriately, have some notice, and just understand what's happening instead of this big, massive rush of bills that occurs in the last, couple of days. And this year, although the rule didn't change, the end of the session in the House, we did not suspend the rules. And I think that is probably for the first time in living memory, we didn't suspend the rules. And lo and behold, we managed, with some very, very good organizational work by the staff, we managed to get it done in a timely manner, while keeping everything posted, while keeping the public informed, and we got through all of our business. And I think that's a real win, and I have to think that it's related to the debate that we had in January.
And if I could just tack on to that, one of the people who was responsible for us not suspending our rules was the minority leader, Blake Filippi. And I really do want to commend him publicly for taking that courageous stand, because he was under a lot of pressure, not just from his Democrat colleagues, but also from some of us in the Republican caucus as well. A number of us had bills that we wanted to see move. And Blake said, no, we're not suspending the rules. He really stuck to his guns, and I have true respect for him.
So, if good, John. So, in either assembly, I kind of consider myself a student of governance, but you need to have leadership. What I've noticed over nearly a 20-year cycle is that what happens is you do have leadership, and that allows things to pass. I mean, not everybody's going to want to vote for everything, so everybody kind of says, you vote for this, I'll vote for that, and that's kind of how things move forward. It's that sausage-making process you've heard about. However, over the years, the rules are used to further consolidate power in one person or in a small group of people, and that comes at the direct expense of each individual member. As the rules change, they evolve to a more kind of upward flow of power to the leadership at the top. Picture a pyramid, all right? As that continues, that becomes even more problematic, because then even lobbyists, other people know that the surest way to get legislation passed is through the titular head at the top of the pyramid, and not through a more democratic process through the membership, which is more democratic and has more input in those things. So I certainly would think, as you talk about more bang for your buck, one of the surest ways that I think, and that I've studied this, to try to break that kind of trend is a redistribution through the rule-making process of power away from, say, the president or the speaker, and then funnel at least down to the committee chair level, whereas if they're more autonomous and more independent, working with the committee members, we'll get more bills passed in a more democratic fashion. Right now, chairs of committees are essentially employees at will. So consider that if you step out of line, you're fired. You know, they get somebody else. There is no independent or objective way, like seniority, that places you as chair. Thank you.
So, and we'll come back to the rules maybe a little bit more at the end as we talk about kind of how the session wrapped up, but I think that was a great point by Representative Knight. And, you know, my hope is that now we have a precedent. They don't suspend the rules again, right? They prove they can get their business done, at least on the House side, without suspending the rules. So now, you know, it was always said we had to suspend our rules or we would never get out of here. Well, they got out of there without suspending them. So hopefully we can bring some pressure in future years not to suspend them.
I want to take you back to almost, I guess, December 2018, January 2019, particularly for the Reform Caucus folks up here, and Mr. Lyle as well, and everybody associated with that change. Two questions. One, if you had to do it all over again in making those issues known and how you felt, would you do it again? Given, and I was encouraged to hear Mr. Lyle say that both the House and the Senate did pass some very key legislation this year. That was nice to hear. But would you do it again? Would you be as strong against both the Speaker and try to make the rules as different as they have been for this past year? And are you going to do it next year?
Yeah.
What's going to happen? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we unfortunately didn't do was to change the rules so that bills could stay live for the full 2 years of the session. I think that it's absolutely scandalous that we have to, once again, introduce legislation in January and February to be studied further. It would be a far more efficient system if they allowed the legislation to stay alive so that we can continue to tweak it and work it and try to convince our colleagues that it's the right way to go.
Yeah, some of the, just following up on some of that, that bill stay alive thing for a couple of years, one of the things that hampers your General Assembly is that we're all part-time. And that comes with some pros in that people aren't, there's not a professional political class as much as there might be as a state where they are full-time. But on the flip side, it's part-time, right? So its capacity for work is smaller than it would be. So if we kept our bills alive for a couple of years, this was the argument, then maybe you could free up the committees to have like public markup sessions. Like we're gonna look at a bill, and we're gonna work on a bill, and maybe we'll hold it for further study. We'll bring it back next week after we do a little research and then suggest some changes and do those sorts of things. And who knows, maybe Rhode Island will get there someday. With respect to your question, the way I try to represent my constituents in the General Assembly is I kind of envision, I use a sports analogy, right? I got a ball, I want to move it down the field. Some days, the correct strategy is kind of defiant opposition, and some days the correct strategy is not defiant opposition, and maybe more of a bridge building technique. I have no, what's the word I'm looking for? I have no regrets about the work that I did on behalf of my constituents through the last half of the election and the beginning of this year, and really through to the end. If I had to do it over again, my goals would be the same. I might choose a different strategy, I might not. And with respect to next year, it all depends. It's like a poker player, right? I know what I'm going to do generally, but I don't know what I'm going to do specifically until I see the cards that are dealt. And the next election cycle has the capacity to change everything. And we'll see where we are. But I will always work to promote small d democracy and to make our government work better and work for everyone instead of just a select few.
Yeah, I'd say I definitely would do that. I always want to be able to come home and look myself in the mirror and feel good about myself. And after 19 years of being up there, it's a tightrope back, I can tell you right now. There are some days where you bridge build, some days you work with the leadership, some days you disagree with leadership. I know I spent a significant amount of, I'll say this publicly now, significant amount of political capital on trying to change the rules of the Senate. And so that wasn't about me, it wasn't about my own personal bills advancing, but it cost me. The other bill that actually, more of a bridge bill that trying to find compromise, spent a lot of capital on was the Reproductive Privacy Act. It was another one I was very involved with behind the scenes in terms of building common ground so that we could bring that bill to the floor and it would have a good chance, or better than good chance of passing.